My son Julian whispered that it was finally time for the nursing home, while I lay paralyzed by the very herbal tea he had served me every night for 10 long years. At 60 years old, I realized he had drained exactly $4 million from my private accounts while I lived in a chemically induced fog inside my own mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. He thought my mind was gone forever, but a broken teacup and a single night of clarity are about to cost him everything he ever stole from my professional life and personal legacy. My name is Martha Sterling, and I am 60 years old, living in a cold, quiet estate where I spent 3 decades building a premier real estate empire before the darkness supposedly settled. For a decade, the world believed I was suffering from early-onset dementia, a tragedy that supposedly stripped a powerful CEO of her dignity and left her entirely dependent on her only son, Julian. I lived in a beautiful prison, a 12-bedroom estate where Julian played the role of the devoted caregiver while secretly dismantling the multi-million-dollar corporation I had spent my entire adult life constructing. Every evening at precisely 8 o'clock, Julian would bring me a steaming porcelain cup of what he called his special restorative blend, claiming the herbs would help preserve my remaining cognitive functions. I remember the smell of chamomile mixed with a faint, metallic bitterness that Julian always insisted was just the natural essence of the organic herbs he imported specifically for my failing cognitive health. After drinking that tea, my world would dissolve into a gray smear where faces lost their names and the clocks on the walls seemed to spin backward while I sat staring out the window. Julian would pat my hand and tell the visiting doctors that I was declining rapidly, showing them forged medical journals he kept to document my supposed episodes of confusion and violent, unprovoked memory loss. He convinced my old board of directors that I had signed over my power of attorney during a brief window of lucidity, allowing him to take the helm of Sterling International Real Estate. I watched through a haze as he sold off our most profitable holdings in Manhattan and Chicago, funneling the proceeds into offshore accounts while telling me that we were simply downsizing for my comfort. My late husband, Arthur, had always warned me that power attracts vultures, but I never imagined that the bird of prey circling my life would be the very child I had carried and raised. The staff in the house were replaced one by one until only those loyal to Julian's payroll remained, people who looked at me with pity or ignored my existence as if I were furniture. I spent 3,650 days trapped in that chemical cage, believing my own mind was betraying me because I trusted the person who shared my own blood and last name. Then came the Tuesday evening when Elena, a new housekeeper hired by a temp agency to cover a weekend shift, accidentally tripped over the expensive Persian rug while carrying my nightly tray. The porcelain cup shattered against the marble floor, sending the dark liquid splashing across my silk slippers, and Julian cursed under his breath before telling me he would go brew a fresh pot. For the first time in a decade, I didn't drink the medicine, and as the clock struck midnight, the heavy fog that usually occupied my skull began to lift like a morning mist. My heart began to race as the sharp edges of the room returned to focus, and I realized I could remember the exact color of the wallpaper and the names of my childhood pets. I stayed perfectly still under my heavy duvet, listening to the silence of the house until I heard the muffled sound of Julian's voice coming from the study located directly down the hallway. I crept toward the door on trembling legs, my muscles weak from years of sedation, and pressed my ear against the wood to hear my son laughing with a woman I didn't recognize. Julian was telling her that the old bird was finally failing and that once the final trust was unlocked next month, they would move to the villa in Spain and leave me behind. He complained about how tedious it was to play the grieving son for 10 years, mentioning the specific dosage of the sedative he had been slipping into my tea since my 50th birthday. The woman laughed and asked if the doctors suspected anything, and Julian bragged about the $200,000 he had paid in bribes to keep my official medical records consistent and terminal. Hearing the cold calculation in his voice felt like a physical blow to my chest, but instead of crying, I felt a spark of the old Martha Sterling reigniting deep within my soul. I realized that he didn't have everything yet, because he mentioned a final, massive trust fund that was still locked behind a security protocol he hadn't been able to bypass with my signature. My husband Arthur was a brilliant engineer before he entered real estate, and he had designed a contingency safe in our home that required more than just a simple pen and paper signature. Julian sounded frustrated as he explained that the bank required a live biometric scan and a specific verbal code that I supposedly couldn't remember in my current state of advanced cognitive decline. I retreated to my bed and pretended to be asleep when Julian checked on me an hour later, my mind working at a speed I hadn't felt since I was closing billion-dollar deals. The next morning, I practiced the foggy look in the mirror, letting my jaw slacken and my eyes wander, just like I had seen myself do in the videos Julian used to record. When he brought me my breakfast, I pretended to forget his name, and I watched the hidden flash of triumph in his eyes as he believed his plan was nearing its final, profitable conclusion. I knew I couldn't go to the local police because Julian had spent a decade building a reputation as a saintly son while painting me as a woman who had completely lost her mind. I needed someone from my past, someone Julian hadn't been able to reach or corrupt, and I remembered Silas Vance, the bulldog attorney who had represented my husband for over 45 years. During the hour when Julian went to the gym, I managed to find my old burner phone hidden in the back of a hollowed-out book in the library, a relic from my business days. My fingers shook as I dialed Silas's private number, praying that he was still alive and that he would recognize the voice of the woman the world thought was a living ghost. When he answered, I didn't waste a second, telling him my name and the exact date of my husband's death to prove my identity before Julian returned from his morning workout at 10. Silas gasped, his voice cracking as he told me he had never believed the dementia story, but Julian had blocked every attempt he made to visit me or review my private medical files. We spoke for only 4 minutes, but it was enough to set a plan in motion that would require me to play the greatest acting role of my life for the next 72 hours. I told Silas about the drugs in the tea and the biometric trust, and he informed me that he still held the original copies of the contingency documents Arthur had drafted in secret. Arthur had known Julian's character better than I did, and he had created a vulture clause that would immediately strip Julian of every cent if I were ever found to be drugged. For the next 3 days, I continued to dump my tea into the potted palms and hide my morning pills under my tongue, feeling my strength return with every hour of clean blood. Julian grew bolder, bringing a notary to my bedside and telling me that we were just signing some papers to ensure my long-term care at a luxury facility in the high mountains. I stared at the papers with vacant eyes, making a sloppy X where he pointed, and I watched him smirk at the notary as if I were nothing more than a broken, useless toy. He scheduled the final bank meeting for Friday at 2 o'clock, intending to bring the bank officials to the house to perform the biometric scan and the verbal code verification in my bedroom. He didn't know that Silas had already contacted the federal authorities and a private medical team that was currently stationed only 3 blocks away from our gated community in Greenwich, Connecticut. Friday morning arrived, and Julian was dressed in a charcoal suit, looking every bit the successful executive, though the company he claimed to lead was nothing but a hollowed-out shell of debt. He coached me for an hour on the verbal code, which was Bluebird 14, a phrase Arthur and I had used for our first vacation home back when we were young and broke. I repeated the words with a stutter, pretending to lose focus every few seconds, which made Julian grit his teeth in a visible display of the monster hiding beneath his expensive silk tie. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and Julian ushered in 3 men in suits who he introduced as the bank's trust officers, but I recognized one of them as Silas's nephew. Julian hovered over me like a protective shadow, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder as he told the men that his mother was having a particularly difficult day with her memory. The lead official placed a sleek, silver biometric scanner on my bedside table and asked me to place my right thumb on the glass while looking directly into the high-resolution optical lens. I felt Julian's fingers tighten on my shoulder, a silent warning to cooperate, and I complied, watching the green light flicker as the system verified my identity against the master records. The official then asked for the verbal confirmation, and Julian leaned in close, whispering the code, Bluebird 14, into my ear as if he were helping a child learn a simple nursery rhyme. I looked Julian directly in the eyes, the vacant stare disappearing instantly, and I spoke in the clear, commanding voice that had once commanded boardrooms from New York City to London, England. I didn't say the code he wanted. Instead, I recited the emergency override phrase Arthur had given me. The falcon sees the shadow on the grass, and the hunt is finally over. The room went deathly silent as the biometric scanner turned a deep, flashing red, and the bank officials suddenly reached into their jackets to produce federal badges and legal warrants for arrest. Julian's face turned a sickly shade of gray, his jaw dropping as he realized that the demented woman he had been drugging for a decade had just walked him into a trap. Silas Vance walked through the bedroom door, carrying a briefcase full of the original trust documents and a court order that stripped Julian of all legal authority over my life and assets. "You're late, Silas," I said, sitting up straight and smoothing my hair, feeling the incredible weight of 10 years of forced silence finally lifting off my tired but very capable shoulders. Julian tried to run, but the federal agents blocked the doorway, informing him that they had recordings of his conversations and proof of the systematic poisoning he had inflicted upon his own mother. He screamed that I was still crazy, that the drugs were for my own good, but the medical team entered the room to take a blood sample that would prove his guilt. As they led him away in handcuffs, I watched my son's departure with a strange mixture of profound grief for the boy he was and cold satisfaction for the man he became. The lead investigator told me that they had already frozen the offshore accounts Julian thought were secret, and that most of my stolen wealth could be recovered through the legal system. Elena, the housekeeper who had accidentally broken the cup, stood in the hallway looking terrified, but I walked over to her and told her she had a job for life. I spent the next 6 hours at the hospital, undergoing a full detoxification protocol and a battery of neurological tests that confirmed my mind was as sharp as a jagged piece of glass. The doctors were amazed at my resilience, but I told them that 30 years of navigating the cutthroat world of real estate had given me a constitution that Julian couldn't break. Silas stayed by my side, explaining that Arthur had suspected Julian's greed early on and had set up the contingency trust specifically to protect me from our own son's potential betrayal. I returned to my mansion that evening, but I didn't feel like a prisoner anymore. I felt like the queen of a castle that had finally been cleared of its most dangerous pest. I sat in my library and looked at the portraits of my ancestors, promising them that I would spend the rest of my life rebuilding the empire Julian had tried to destroy. The news of this sterling miracle hit the financial papers the next morning, and the board of directors who had abandoned me were suddenly ringing my phone, begging for a meeting. I declined every single call, knowing that the people who hadn't bothered to check on a dying woman weren't the kind of partners I wanted for the second chapter of my life. Julian was denied bail after the toxicology report showed levels of sedatives in my system that were 3 times the legal limit for a person of my age and physical weight. His mistress, the woman I had heard laughing in the study, turned state's evidence within 48 hours, trading her testimony for a reduced sentence and a chance to avoid a long prison term. I visited Julian in the county jail only once, sitting behind the glass partition and looking at the man who had stolen 10 years of my life for the sake of money. He asked for my forgiveness, but I told him that I had already given him everything a mother could give, and he had chosen to spit on my love for a villa in Spain. "You forgot one thing, Julian," I said quietly into the intercom, watching him flinch at the sound of my voice. "I am Martha Sterling, and I never lose a negotiation." I walked out of that jail and felt the sun on my face, a warmth I hadn't truly felt since I was 50, and I realized that 60 was a perfect age to begin again. I hired a new executive team, mostly young women who reminded me of myself, and we began the grueling process of auditing every single transaction Julian had made over the last decade. We found that he had been more incompetent than I thought, losing millions on bad investments and vanity projects that I was able to write off as fraudulent losses for tax purposes. Within 18 months, Sterling International was not only recovered, but was actually more profitable than it had been before the dementia took hold of its founder and original visionary leader. I established the Arthur Sterling Foundation for Elder Protection, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal and medical advocacy for seniors who are being exploited by their own family members or caregivers. I realized that my story was rare because I had the resources to fight back, but there are thousands of others trapped in the fog without a broken teacup to save them. Elena became my head of household, and we turned the cold Greenwich mansion into a place of light and music, filling the rooms with guests who actually cared about my well-being. I sold the 12-bedroom estate and moved into a penthouse in the city, wanting to be closer to the heartbeat of the business world I had reclaimed from the depths of betrayal. Sometimes at night, I still look at a cup of tea and feel a momentary shiver of fear, but then I remember the feel of the marble under my feet that night. I kept a single shard of the broken porcelain cup on my desk as a paperweight, a constant reminder that even the most fragile things can lead to a powerful, life-changing breakthrough. My lawyer, Silas, eventually retired, but we remained close friends, often sharing a glass of wine on my balcony while we discussed the latest shifts in the New York property market. Julian was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, a fate he earned through every drop of medicine he forced down his mother's throat for a decade of greedy, cold-hearted lies. I don't hate him anymore because hate is a heavy burden that I no longer wish to carry, but I will never forget the lesson that even blood can turn into poison. I am 70 years old now, and my mind has never been clearer, my business has never been stronger, and my heart has finally found the peace that Julian tried to steal. I recently walked into a boardroom to finalize a merger worth $900 million, and as I took my seat at the head of the table, I felt Arthur's presence. The executives across from me were half my age, but they looked at me with a respect that had been earned through fire and betrayal, and they knew I was the boss. I looked at the documents, checked the clauses for any hidden traps, and signed my name with a flourish that was bold, certain, and completely, wonderfully lucid in the bright morning light. I spent my weekend at the beach house I bought with the money recovered from Julian's offshore accounts, watching the waves and thinking about the incredible strength of the human spirit. Life tried to dim my light for 10 years, but the darkness only made the eventual sunrise look more beautiful than I ever could have imagined during those long, gray years of silence. I am a survivor, a businesswoman, and a woman who reclaimed her soul from the hands of a thief, and I will spend every remaining day living with my eyes wide open. Every morning, I make my own coffee, savoring the bitter strength of the beans and the simple joy of knowing exactly where I am and exactly who I am in this world. I have written a new will, one that ensures my legacy will support the vulnerable long after I am gone, creating a shield for those who cannot defend themselves against family greed. My story is a warning to the predators and a promise to the victims that the truth has a way of shattering the most carefully constructed lies when you least expect it. I look at my hands, once thin and trembling, now steady and strong, and I know that the empire of Martha Sterling is finally in the only hands it can ever trust. I walked through the park today and saw a mother playing with her son, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, but I quickly replaced it with deep gratitude. I am grateful for the housekeeper who tripped, for the husband who planned ahead, and for the mind that refused to stay broken despite a decade of chemical warfare against its survival. I have reclaimed my name, my fortune, and my future, and I stand as a testament to the fact that justice is a dish best served with a very clear, sober mind. The fog is gone, the sun is high, and the woman in the mirror is someone I am proud to know, a woman who came back from the dead to claim her life. Now I sit in the garden of my new home, watching the sunset over the Atlantic, knowing that the empire I built is finally safe and my dignity has been restored forever.